So, once upon a time, there was a minnow named Wjooje. And you see, this minnow, though it was small, this minnow had big dreams, big hopes. And so a passion was ignited inside the heart of Wjooje when he saw all of a sudden these enormous machines come and start to dig on the seashore of the bay right where he lived. And he was pretty afraid. You see, all of the rest of the minnows in his little community, they knew that their life would be forever altered, that many of them probably wouldn't make it, that bad things were going to happen if these buildings were built. But they were so small. They were so small and oddly translucent, and they didn't know that they could do anything, and so they were really afraid. So the more the big machines came and they started digging up, landing huge pylons and really destroying the world as they knew it. Now, there had been rising levels of mercury in the water, and so strange things were happening in Wjooje's brain, and every once in a while he could catch the simulcast of some of these sermons. It was odd. It was odd, and all of a sudden in his brain he started hearing the things that were on our little microphones, and he started hearing about this diving deeper over and over and over again. Dive deep, dive deep, dive deep, and there was no hope for the minnow people except for potentially him to dive deep. And so he did, even though he was so small, so infinitesimally small. And no minnow had ever traveled far deep into the ocean. But he knew that this was their only hope, and so he set off. He set off and he started swimming as fast as he could, and he just went deeper and deeper, as deep as he could possibly go. And see, there was a legend in these parts that there was a huge beast, an enormous sea monster that lived, but he wasn't afraid because none of the fish really believed that that was true. But still, just in the same way that you don't really believe things, sometimes there's a little bit of fear in the back of his heart. And so he swam deeper and deeper, and he knew that it didn't really exist, but still, he saw all of a sudden this large thing off in the distance. It was kind of swimming towards him, but he had to screw up all of his courage and muster the strength of every one of his scales, and he swam straight towards it. And he said, I know it's going to be okay, I know it's going to be okay. And all of a sudden, he was close enough that he could see. And it wasn't actually one big thing. It was hundreds and hundreds of sardines. They just looked like one big thing from a distance. And an idea started to hatch in his brain, but it wasn't yet full. So he had to go deeper, deeper still. And the water got darker and darker and colder, and his tiny little minnow body was starting to shiver. And as soon as he could almost see nothing, almost entirely dark, there was a glowing point of light off in the distance. And something evolutionarily inside him knew that he probably shouldn't go towards that glowing point of light, but he was so entranced and so curious that he swam towards the glowing point of light. And as soon as he got close enough, he looked at it and he saw it almost looked like an eyeball. But as soon as he was looking up at it thinking, God, that looks like an eyeball, the next thing he thought was thousands of glowing phosphorescent teeth. There was a huge fish that was about to eat him, and as soon as the fish was about to snap its jaws down on him, it looked and it was like, it'll cost me more calories to chew you than I'm going to get from eating you. And the fish was like, what are you doing this deep? What are you doing in these dark? You people are way up at the top. You're out of your element. But they became quick friends, as sometimes you do with people who are very, very different than you. And he looked at the glowing thing and he says, how do you pull off that glowing thing? He was fascinated, and the plan started to hatch even more. And so he sailed right back up to the surface, super, super fast. And the rest of the minnows in his community saw him coming, but he didn't look like himself anymore. You see, his entire body was covered in that phosphorescent glowing eye goo. Somehow he had bartered a deal. We don't have time to get into it. But the fish with all the teeth was very generous with his glowing phosphorescent eye goo, and he somehow squeezed some out on him. Anyway, so he was glowing. And he came back to his minnow friends and he says, I have a plan, I have an idea. And so it was that the surveyor, the head foreman person of the entire building project, was wading out into the bay in his huge hip waders, starting to decide where all the final pylons would be, where the large seafood restaurant would stretch out and a very, very big deck would go out over where the minnows used to live. And he heard this strange rumbling, and the top of the ocean started to ripple just a little bit. And he looked off in the distance there, and there were these two tiny glowing points of light coming towards him. Now all the workmen, all the other people who were helping out, they had heard of this beast that was living inside of the bay, and so they started running right away. But the foreman tried to convince him, no, it's not a beast, it's gonna be fine. And still a little bit of fear, and he turned around. And the next thing he knew, he saw those two glowing points of light and thousands of minnows all together as one beast leapt up at him, covered him, and sucked him right back out into the ocean. And all the workmen ran away so afraid. And nothing was ever built there again. Now, minnows have no taste for human bodies. So he was spared. He was spit back up down the shore a ways. But to be sure, he never tried to develop that land again. And that minnow and the rest of his people lived till they were large minnows of a very similar size. Amen. And you can rise and go off